Welcome to Zoo Media 5. I'm your anchor, Michael Scott. On tonight's news, we will be discussing a high-profile case that involves a Caucasian male in his early 60s with a great receding hairline. You may know him as a wealthy financier with famous connections, but recently surfaced court documents reveal a much darker reality. This man is no other than Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein has pleaded guilty to soliciting prostitution from minors and has been convicted on charges of sex trafficking. We will also be discussing the victims that were trafficked, like Virginia Goodfrey at 16, Sarah Ramsey in her early 20s, and many others. I'm here with panelists Seth Tibbett, Jasmine Taviz, and Alexandra Agama, who will be discussing this case in further detail. Discuss the factors that made the victim vulnerable to the chosen topic.
Okay, so the first question I am going to discuss or answer is what made the victims in this case, specifically the Epstein case, vulnerable and the factors behind it. So before I get into that, I want to talk about vulnerabilities, what they are, and some common vulnerabilities between victims of human trafficking. So vulnerabilities are what make individuals more at risk of being a victim of a crime. So in this case, vulnerabilities make victims more at risk of being victims through sex trafficking. So many factors make victims vulnerable. Vulnerabilities consist of homelessness, maybe being a runaway, lack of love, lack of self-worth, low self-esteem, and then lack of finances, and so many more. When it comes to human trafficking and sex trafficking in general, there are tons of different vulnerabilities that make individuals at risk. So he often targeted victims who had high aspirations. And this could have been like wanting to go to college or getting a job. So there are many factors that made his victims vulnerable. So they may have grown up in a foster care system, they may have grown up in a broken household, and they maybe were abused. So in an article titled Jeffrey Epstein's Alleged Sex Trafficking Targets, the More Vulnerable, the Better, investigator says by Aaliyah Destagir says, quote, he preyed upon children who were already vulnerable, said Martina Vandenberg, founder and president of the Human Trafficking Legal Center, about the latest allegations involving Epstein. He preyed upon children in the foster care system. He preyed upon children already being abused. End of quote.
What are the motives for the traffickers to target the victims within your specific topic?
Okay, there are several common motives that sex traffickers have for targeting their victims, which one of the most common reasons is for financial gain. Traffickers see a need to fulfill a demand for sex services, so they recruit others and sell them to buyers like Johns or James in order to profit off. Such people have entered this billion-dollar industry because normal jobs do not provide them with wages that sustain the life that they're living or support the needs of their families. However, in this particular case, Epstein's motive was to maintain a sense of power and control over his victims and used their vulnerabilities to obtain instant gratification from them, which in this case was through inappropriate sex services in which he disguised as ordinary jobs as masseuses. It is also very common for sex traffickers to choose children to exploit because they are more naive and easier to manipulate or scared to do things for them.
My other question is, discuss the role the trafficker played in luring the victim.
The next question I want to address is the roles that Epstein played in luring his victims. So before I get into that, I want to talk about the different roles that traffickers can play when it comes to a human trafficking operation. So there are many roles that traffickers can play in order to lure victims into a sex trafficking ring. The roles that traffickers may play are recruiter, transporter, exploiter, supervisor, and manager. So I argue that Epstein played many different roles when it comes to his operation. So I argue that he played the role of recruiter, transporter, exploiter, and manager. Epstein played the role of recruiter by locating his victims and exploiting them. I argue that he also played the role of transporter by transporting his victims. He also played the role of exploiter by taking advantage of his victims, and he played the role of manager by managing his whole sex trafficking operation.
And my very last question for you guys, how did this trafficker / victim or both come to under suspicious or ended up being arrested? If they were not arrested, explain why.
So Jeffrey Epstein came under suspicion and it later led to his arrest because Julie K. Brown was the first victim that spoke up to her family about her being molested by Jeffrey Epstein, leading her family to come forward to her local police department stating that she was molested and abused by Epstein and his colleague. This spiked so much attention that other victims from the high school came forward and joined Julie in the investigation to bring justice because of the molestation and cases of rape and abuse that Jeffrey Epstein had put these victims through. They later confirmed that it would all happen at his Palm Beach mansion, and they later told the police that Epstein hired them to give them sexual massages. In 2008, Epstein was sent to prison, having pleaded guilty to the charge of prostitution of a girl below the age of 18. It was the culmination of a 3-year investigation involving first state and then federal authorities. The local police had uncovered evidence that Epstein had sexually coerced and abused young women and girls, some as young as 13 to 14 years old. There was also a number of testaments of rape. The child was never arrested. None of the victims were ever arrested. However, they did face long-term effects that ended up some in death, some in being integrated into criminal behavior, and Epstein became more suspicious because of the violations of standard prison procedures and Epstein's knowledge of compromising information about famous individuals. Later, his death spawned skepticism and multiple conspiracy theories, and he was able to evade a lot of prosecution from authorities due to his amount of power and money that he had, and not to mention the connections that he had with many people, political figures, authorities, law authorities, and law enforcement.
So the third thing I want to address is a theory that explains why Epstein committed the crimes that he did. So before I get into that, I want to discuss some of the main causes of child sex trafficking. So one of the main causes of this is supply and demand, meaning that there are traffickers willing to exploit children to meet the wants of the buyers. So human trafficking produces a lot of money a year, and according to an Exodus quote, generates 150 billion USD per year, end of quote. So financial gain is one of the main reasons why I believe Epstein committed his crimes. A theory that explains this is rational choice theory. The theories behind rational choice theory is Cornish and Clark in 1987. According to an article called Rational Choice Theory of Criminology by Aisha Pereira explains what this theory explains. She says, quote, it assumes individuals decide to offend based on cost-benefit analysis of both personal factors and situational factors, choosing to commit crimes when the perceived benefits outweigh the potential costs. End of quote. This applies to this case because of the amount of money that Epstein may have received. Many traffickers may see that human trafficking has a low risk and high profit. Therefore, Epstein may have looked at human trafficking in the same way. He could have seen that he could make tons of money at a low risk.
Okay, evidently Epstein is to blame for all of these crimes. Under routine activities theory, which was created by Marcus Felsen and Lawrence Cohen in 1979, it states that a crime occurs when 3 elements converge, which are a motivated offender, a suitable target, and a lack of capable guardian. As a motivated offender, Epstein targeted and took advantage of all these young girls, especially because their parents weren't around and because he knew they would all need money. He used these vulnerabilities to his advantage. The criminal justice system would definitely classify him as a recruiter, as he actively recruited minors and promised them money in exchange for the sex acts they gave him. A part of the job was massaging him, in which he would often have them undress for him and would even grope their private parts or sometimes masturbate to them. Epstein is a wealthy man who knew he could easily get away with his crimes, so he sexually exploited these young girls for his own sick pleasure. Who knows what he would have done if they tried to protest against him. While we don't know if he was ever sexually abused or experienced trauma as a child, this does not excuse his behavior. All we know is that he is a man with money and power, and he was able to use his status to manipulate those around him and to allow his crime to continue for so long. Although many of his victims remain unnamed due to privacy reasons and minority status, we just want to say that our hearts go out to those who have been victimized by him and other people much like him. This is a sad world that we live in.
So now, the theory that I will be covering is string theory, and this specifically applies to the victims. So in 1938, Robert King Merton proposed that pressure derived from social factors such as lack of income, lack of quality of education, drives individuals to commit crime. In the Epstein case, the aftermath took a deathly toll on many of the victims, serving them with long-term effects and trauma, which they now face addictions. The New York Post highlighted the fatal death of Caroline Andrino, who was 36 years old at the time of her drug overdose. She was only 14 years old when the abuse started. Police later found a small crack pipe, a small baggie with white residue, and a needle in her purse at the time of her death. An in-shoe of Toxicology reported also found methadone, fentanyl, and alprazolam in her system, and Pitts, her ex-husband, told them that Caroline had been using drugs for a long time. She was a victim of Jeffrey Epstein and his accomplice for many years before she was able to escape. Caroline had also testified at Maxwell's trial that she had become addicted to drugs while visiting Jeffrey Epstein's Virgin Islands compound as a teenager. She said, and I quote, "Marijuana, cocaine, alcohol, anything that could block out for me to go to the next appointment." She also said that she took methadone, an antidepressant, Xanax, and a drug for schizophrenia because later, as an adult, when she had children, she faced a lot of trauma, and she was scared that if she retaliated or testified against Epstein, that retaliation would later turn into vengeance against her and her children. So she said, and I quote, "I am scared that my kids are going to get kidnapped." This was only one of the testimonies out of the hundreds of victims that were involved. The long effects of strain forever kept Caroline a victim in her own body and mind. Going off of what Jasmine shared earlier, a lot of these victims had these long-term effects that affected them, not only from when they initially became victims, but it carried on into their adulthood, which one of these many cases, she was left dead because of the drug overdose that she faced, because of the drug addiction that she started having when she was 14 years old at the time of these encounters. Strain theory also applies to another case of one of his victims, because there was a young girl that came from Britain to his New York mansion in Manhattan, and she was an aspiring artist, and she was going to school in college, and to make her dream come true, she saw one of Jeffrey's listings as a masseuse to come to his mansion and serve him as staff, and she was obviously intrigued because of the money that she was going to get paid. However, she said that when she would enter his mansion, it would start off as a friendly encounter. She knew she was there to do a job. However, later Jeffrey would make her unclothe herself, rope her, and make her do heinous things to him while he was a full-grown man naked laying there. And this was a tactic of manipulation, and it was a tactic for him to make it seem normal to her. And to cover it up, Jeffrey was able to throw money at his victims. One of the victims in the Department of Justice report stated that he gave her around $300 to $400 at a time, and if she brought more friends to come work for Epstein, he would then give her a bonus and give her more money and give the other victims money as well. So as an artist that is trying to make it, she has lack of resources, she doesn't have a high income, and New York is expensive, being in college is expensive, so this money that was being thrown at her, yes, there was a downside to it. However, it kept her enticed to keep coming back and keep getting abused by him.
The other panelists and I were debriefing earlier, and we all collectively agree that he's clearly a sick individual. And I don't mean that he needs medical attention or anything like that. I just think he's absolutely disgusting and the worst kind of human being out there. He deserves the worst kind of punishment, and if they still use the electric chair, I would say he deserves just that. That man should not have the opportunity for parole and should spend the rest of his time alive in solitary confinement until his execution. I mean, think about it. He sexually exploited multiple girls in Planet 2. That has to account for multiple charges of sexual abuse and sex trafficking of a minor. He should not be able to step foot outside of prison ever again for repeatedly taking advantage of dozens of minors. No child deserved that, and no parent should have to hear that their child had gone through these things as well. If he had any sort of remorse for his victims, he wouldn't have let the number of victims pile up. These were all young teenagers who were desperate for money, and he preyed on their vulnerabilities in order to seek his own gratification. He doesn't need help. Epstein clearly knew what he was doing, and we all think he needs to be executed immediately.
So one of the recommendations in order to address the issue of juvenile runaways who end up being sex trafficked, we recommended that they implement a comprehensive prevention and intervention program targeted at a vulnerable youth provided by foster care systems. So these programs would focus on providing support, education, and resources to those at risk to prevent the idea of running away, to effectively intervene. Programs can include community outreach, education initiatives aimed at raising awareness about the risks and dangers of being a runaway and being sex trafficked. The programs would inform individuals of safe places to turn for help if they are victims of abuse or exploitation. Additionally, prevention efforts should address what factors contribute to a minor running away, which may include family conflict, homelessness, substance abuse, and mental health issues. With these, we may provide counseling, assistance, and/or other support services. Intervention programs should focus on identifying and reaching out to the youth who are at risk, who potentially/will currently have been engaged in running away and sex trafficked. This could involve collaboration with law enforcement, social services, schools, and community organizations to identify and respond to cases of runaway youth and provide them with support. Intervention efforts should prioritize the safety and well-being of the youth involved in the system, offering them shelter, counseling, legal advocacy, and access to medical care as needed. By implementing comprehensive prevention and intervention programs, communities can better protect vulnerabilities in the youth and reduce the risk of exploitation and sex trafficking. For example, the girl that came from another country and was abused at his New York mansion, one of her vulnerabilities was that she didn't have family around or a parent to be supervised. Also, with that, she doesn't have social support or economic support. What that means is that New York is expensive. She was in college. She probably couldn't get a job at that age while she was in high school and then went to college. So the money that was being thrown at her through the abuse was enticing and it kept her being there. So by adding these programs, it could definitely be a form of prevention to further more victims of sex trafficking.
The fourth thing I want to discuss is an organization that addresses the issue of sex trafficking. So an organization that deals with child sex trafficking is called Operation Underground Railroad, or OUR. This organization was founded by an ex-federal agent named Tim Ballard. According to an Operation Underground Railroad's website, a part of their mission statement is as follows, quote, "Our work spans the globe as we assist law enforcement in rescue efforts and help provide aftercare to all those affected. While we prioritize children, we work to empower the liberation of anyone suffering at the hands of those looking to sexually exploit," end of quote. This organization has done amazing work to help children break free from the human trafficking ring. It's on us to stop sex trafficking.
It's on us to stop sex trafficking.
It's on us to stop human trafficking.
I want to thank the panelists for coming out and speaking with me today. And again, it's on us to stop sex trafficking. Thank you. Good night.
Okay.
That was so much.
Panelist Alexandria.
There. That should be fine. Okay, wait. So Mia, right now that was question 2.
Yeah.
And now you're gonna move on to
Cut it.
Seth's section. You're gonna cut it and then put in my section. So this will be the next clip.
It's on us to stop human trafficking.